Welcome, fans, to a special Thursday edition of the Great North Wrestling Podcast. My name is Jack Kilby, Executive Vice President of Great North Wrestling. And tonight I'm very pleased to welcome a man who holds many hats, has many interests and careers in professional wrestling, but most notably now, the author of a tremendous book on the original Sheik. I'll see if the camera can get it. Blood and Fire, the unbelievable real life story of wrestling's original Sheik, who has some ties to Canada, some significant ties to Canada, and being the Great North Wrestling Podcast, we are a Canadian centric podcast. So we'll get into that. But Mr. Brian R. Solomon, how are you tonight, sir?
I'm doing very well, Jack, and thanks for having me on the show.
Well, we appreciate your time, but before we get into a discussion of your book and the career of the Sheik, I was wondering if you would have any thoughts as a well vaunted wrestling historian on the recent passing of Mr. Jerry Jarrett.
Well, I mean, he was a giant. There's nothing that I could say that hasn't been said for sure, but I mean, I think what his most important legacy that you have to remember is he really was the last of the territory promoters. I mean, the major territories in North America, particularly US and Canada, he was the last one. I mean, Memphis Wrestling continued on until 1997. He was a part of it till 1995. But I mean, you're talking about long after the WWF expansion was complete. And they were able, he and Jerry Lawler, they were able to create something really special in Memphis, a community, a wrestling bubble in the best sense of the term that was maybe stronger than anywhere else in the country. And the most impenetrable and immune to invasion. And I think you also have to give them credit for the influence. And I don't know if they get enough credit because, people talk about Paul Heyman nowadays and the influence that ECW had on everything. And I think Paul Heyman would be the first one to tell you that Memphis was one of the biggest influences on him and the time he spent there and the years that he came through the business. Also, Atsushi Onita, who wound up taking the lessons that he learned there and bringing them to Japan. I mean, they really were ahead of their time. And that's something that's not always remembered today because sometimes people have this idea in their head of Memphis wrestling as this like grand old traditional wrestling territory of the South. It was not. It was wild and crazy and non-traditional, and it didn't always have the best reputation at the time within the business with the other promoters because it was so radical. They talk today about how this and that person are killing the business, and that was one of the things that was levied at the Memphis territory. But I think history has judged them well. History has judged Jerry Jarrett well for all the contributions he made, and then later even reinventing himself and co-founding TNA Wrestling. I mean, what more of an impact could you hope to have on the business? There was even the story that Vince McMahon apparently had him lined up in the mid-90s if he went away to jail for all the various things that he was on the verge of going to jail for, that Jerry Jarrett, who he had working relationships with because Memphis and WWF were working together, Jerry Jarrett was going to come in and run the day-to-day operations of the WWF if need be. I mean, if that doesn't tell you how well regarded and trusted the man was, I mean, nothing will, right?
Absolutely. And I think with respect to Jerry Jarrett, we're fortunate to have quite a body of his work on tape because he falls within that era where we had that capability and fans generations from now can go back and look at that. But I wanted to ask you kind of as a sidebar on this question on your own very excellent podcast, Shut Up and Wrestle. You talk about preserving history and how important that is to the business and how years from now people will not know 50, 60 years from now who Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair was, but you can refer them to the archival footage, et cetera, et cetera. How important is it for people like yourself, historians, authors, to capture points of the business that aren't necessarily represented on YouTube or hard media that some territories are lucky to have.
Well, I mean, it's very important. Like you said, one of the things that wrestling of the 80s, let's say, and beyond has to its benefit is, like I said, you can point to video evidence, but for the stuff that's not documented in that way, I mean, it's even more important to preserve because you lose the sense of what the perspectives of the time were if you don't. It's like I said, I've said it on my show. Like, you can say to people, "Oh, you want to know why the Midnight Express was great? Look them up, and you're going to learn in about an hour. You'll be able to know, oh my God, yes, this is maybe the greatest tag team of all time." You can't really do that. You can't say to people the same thing about, let's say, Jim Londos. If you want to learn about the fact that Jim Londos basically almost created the character of the baby face in wrestling, created the comeback, created the idea of this ethnic draw, New York City. He was Bruno before Bruno. Yeah, there's scraps of footage, but it's like telling somebody to look up, watch Babe Ruth play. I mean, you're not going to get a sense. I mean, you can get an idea of let's say Hank Aaron, right, or of what a player he was, but Babe Ruth, I mean, from a few bits of really sped up newsreel footage. No, you have to go by anecdotes. You have to go. I mean, in things like baseball, you can go by statistics, not as much in wrestling, but in wrestling, it's anecdotes and stories. And without that, yeah, things will be forgotten. Like, again, like I've said on the show, in the first half of the 20th century, almost anybody who knew wrestling would say that the greatest wrestler of all time was Frank Gotch. I mean, and that's an attitude that continued for a couple of generations. And then Frank Gotch left living memory. And now nobody says that anymore, unless you're somebody who's an extremely studied historian and observer, like someone like a Mike Chapman. And like I said, and that's where it started, what you had said, that's going to happen to everybody. And people like Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair or Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, we have the benefit today of, it's a little easier because there's video. But what we know is, and all you got to do is spend a lot of time among teenagers and young people, is just because it's out there and they have more options today than ever of what they could watch at the tip of a button, of a finger, just because it's there does not mean it's going to be sought out. So there's still work that will have to be done for sure.
Which is, I think, a germane point that one of your guests on your podcast, Mike Sempervive, brought out was, if you have a particular, I mean, it was speaking in reference to the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame, but if you have a particular individual that you feel is being overlooked, get it out there. And even if it's on an obscure podcast, or you write something, raise that awareness so fans can discover that and absolutely have them take the place in history that they deserve before it's absolutely forgotten.
Yeah. Yeah, we all have those for the people that vote. I mean, for me, it's not even so much somebody that's forgotten or overlooked as somebody that I just think the voting system does no favors. And my own personal cause is Sergeant Slaughter. And
Yeah.
as I've said, every year I vote for him. I mean, I worked with Sarge at WWE. He wrote the foreword to my first book, WWE Legends, and he really did write it. And, to me, it's one of those things. It's like, how do you put it into words? Well, just the idea of there being any kind of wrestling Hall of Fame that Sergeant Slaughter is not in is just strange. And I don't know how else to put it. And it's like, if you mention it to somebody that doesn't even know a lot about wrestling, but was around in the 80s, let's say, and you say, Sergeant Slaughter, yeah, he never makes it in, they're going to look at you like you're nuts. And that means something. There's a reason people think that way. It's because he had cultural crossover and cachet. I mean, this is a man who was stopped on an airplane by Richard Nixon, for an autograph and a photo.
Yes.
That's somebody who belongs in the Hall of Fame. That's all. That, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, hats off to yourself and authors like yourself that produce books, and shout out to the Arcadian Vanguard Podcast Network, one of my favorite series of podcasts that are dedicated to preserving and raising awareness of the history of the business, which, as you pointed out before, is not exactly mainstream in the cultural zeitgeist. So it's important work. But turning to the Sheik, speaking of one of the most mysterious characters, mythological in proportions, what was what your original impetus for deciding to write about the Sheik in his
Well,
career?
one part of it actually ties into exactly what we're talking about, because now I'm old enough now and I've been a wrestling fan long enough to see these kinds of to see people's names fade away from memory. And the thing that got me, and I didn't realize it at first, but once it really sunk in, was the fact that, when I was a kid and watching wrestling, late 80s, early 90s, the Sheik was already pretty much out of the scene, especially as far as American wrestling. However, if you talk to people who knew wrestling, everybody knew the Sheik. The Sheik was this legend of the past. He was like up there with Bruno and Andre the Giant. He was you knew he had been a major name. You saw him in wrestling magazines. That's how I knew about him. This lunatic, oh, I wish I had gotten to see him, blah, blah, blah. Everyone knew. And then once I made the realization in recent years of going, I don't think that is common knowledge anymore. Especially, I think that the average person, wrestling fan under 40, may not even know who he was. And if you say Sheik in wrestling, 90% of people are going to say the Iron Sheik. And that was not the case when I first became a wrestling fan in the late 80s. And so that's when I said, oh my God, wow, this has really changed. This is someone who's never had a book done about them. See, that was important. Never had it done. Never, I couldn't think of another star at his level, particularly of his era, who was bigger than he was, that had never had a book done about him. And that made the choice easy for me. I just said, this is the guy. I mean, it's criminal. There's got to be something done.
And you've spoken on your podcast again about a bit about the research process, which I want to ask you. What struck me was the fact that you said, I believe again it was with the episode with Mike, where you said, I really wish I would have decided to take this on 20 years ago, because there would have been so many major figures to interview and speak to. But in the time frame that you decided to write the book and do the research, what did that process look like?
Well, in the beginning, it was a little bit intimidating because, as I've said, if I had picked up this idea 20 years ago, I think I would have had a much easier time. The amount of, all the major, not all, almost all the major players are gone. The people to talk to were really, in a lot of cases, people that were on the fringe of it, or maybe people that were just starting out when he was finishing up, and now those people are old. You know what I mean? So I started, I decided to start with the interviews because, number one, I didn't want to lose any more people. I mean, there were about 5, 6, 7 people closely connected to the history of Detroit and Toronto wrestling who died while I was writing the book. And that includes both of the Sheik's sons. So I thought, well, let's do the interviews first and get as much of those ideas and perspectives down, and then that will lead me down the other roads and get me going in the right directions. And then after that is when I started doing research. And thank God for the internet and for, the resources available, especially at the time I was writing it, which was in the lockdown, in the pandemic, when I couldn't even fly to Detroit if I wanted to. And I was able to really dig deep. You have to know where to go. It takes time. I mean, I was able to find military records, obviously the wrestling stuff. That's the easiest stuff to find, believe it or not. But military records, family history on ancestry.com, incredible for people think of it for looking up their own family, but you can look up anyone's family. Trust me. That death certificate, birth certificate, and the further along I went, then once word got out that I was doing the book, people started coming to me and saying, oh, I interviewed Eddie Jr. once. Would you want to see a transcript of the interview? Or here's a guy you should talk to, this person that I had never heard of, And so then it started to snowball. And I spent 6 months of just doing this without even writing a single word, or because I also wanted to have an arc. I didn't want it to just be a collection of events and chronological. It's boring. I wanted there to be like a narrative, almost like you're reading a novel. Like this person's life had a journey. What's the journey? And once I had that formed in my head, then I could start writing. So I mean, I signed the contract in November 2019. I probably didn't start actually writing until June of 2020, I want to say. And I finished by about March of 2021.
Now, in the book, you cite something that admittedly I was not aware of, that he started his career basically as himself, and then morphed into an early version of this persona, if you will. Can you enlighten the fans as to how this came about and what his motivation was at that time?
That was something that I discovered that I don't think anybody living even knew anymore. I think anyone who knew about it was gone, because even the most fanatical fans and even people who were connected to him professionally were not aware. People kept telling me, well, okay, he had his first match in 1949 against Louis Klein, and he was already the Sheik of Araby. And I remember going like, I mean, it's possible, but that would be very rare in the business that somebody with a high concept gimmick like that just walked out for the first time for his first match with that gimmick. I just kept thinking, oh, it can't be. And sure enough, I dug deep enough and I found it. And, the thing was, he started wrestling while he was in the Army. He fought in World War II briefly. He was overseas. Started wrestling there. When he came back, he would be one of these guys, working out at the YMCA, wrestling. He was discovered there. And really, the closest thing to a gimmick, what they did was, he was this clean cut, believe it or not, good looking kid, hometown boy, Lansing, Michigan's own Eddie Farhat, come back from the war, and now he's the local hero. That was it. And there was a place called the Prudden Auditorium, I believe it's pronounced, in Lansing, which is no longer there, but it was like the local, venue, basically, a few hundred people. And he had his first match there in 1947, and he was returning GI, sweet and lovable Eddie Farhat, and he had a few matches there, not too many, but a few, and then he kind of got taken under the wing of Bert Ruby and Harry Light, who were like the local Detroit promoters, and it was by about 49, about a year and a half in, maybe 2 years in, that the Sheik of Araby was really created and started. But yeah, he did. He wrestled. In fact, there's a rare picture of him in the newspaper, which made it into the book, where he's just himself in wrestling gear. And I had seen that picture pop up on websites and things, and somebody took like a Sharpie to it. This is how, maybe it was the Sheik himself, who the heck knows, and drew like a beard on the face and a little camel on the trunks, just to make it look like, oh yeah, he was the Sheik. He was just really young, but he absolutely was not the Sheik when he first started wrestling. He was just Eddie Farhat.
Yeah, that's fascinating stuff. And as you mentioned, a lot of fans, well, everyone probably did not know that. I found one of the interesting parts of the book was your discussion of how Sheik came to Homestead in Michigan and the roots of the interpromotional war with the Bruiser. Could you summarize that for the fans?
Sure. Well, the Sheik had been wrestling for about, believe it or not, about 16, 17 years before he really became the headline star in Detroit. And that was because he bought the company. So in 1964, he bought Big Time Wrestling from I'm drawing a blank. Jim Barnett and Johnny Doyle, right? They were the original owners of Big Time Wrestling, and they founded it in 1959. He bought it, and before that, he had been a star. I mean, he wrestled for Fred Kohler in Chicago on national TV in the 50s, but he was a mid-carder. He spent about a year or two in Capitol Wrestling, working for Vince McMahon Sr. He was a tag team wrestler. He was a mid-card attraction. But by the end of 64, going into 65, he becomes a top level, top flight main event star. And so now he's running big time wrestling. He's got Detroit Cobo Arena. He's got the Cincinnati Gardens, Toledo Sports Arena. He's got Dayton, which later was the Harrah Arena. There was a venue before that. And then he's going into Ontario. The Tunnies were really running Ontario, but there were some border areas like Windsor that he would go into, and that was his territory, his fiefdom. But the interesting thing about him is, unlike some other guys that would homestead, like Vern Gagne homesteaded in Minneapolis when he started the AWA, he had been a national star. Fritz von Erich homesteaded in Dallas. He was a little different, the Sheik. And in fact, the Funks were kind of like this too, where he would still do a lot of traveling and he would still headline all over the country, all over the world, and then come back to his home territory. He didn't just stay there. He was able to do that because he was such a powerful draw. And so he never kind of faded into the background. He never just became the promoter because there was just too much money to be made.
And you mentioned that in the late '60s and early '70s that Detroit territory was one of the hottest in the country in terms of box office, and yet he was brought into other areas, like you said, and including brought in by Vince Sr. to have a program or feud with Bruno. Can you enlighten the fans as to just how successful that business was at that period of time?
Which business? You mean his own or
the Detroit business?
Oh,
yes.
Yeah. I mean, there was a period in the late 60s, early 70s where it was one of the hottest, if not the hottest territory in the country. From about 1967 through about 1973, you could make a case that it was maybe the hottest territory in the business. And at least outside of it, let's just say in North America, because you had World Championship Wrestling in Australia, which was very hot too. But it didn't last. That's the thing. When it burned bright and then it just burnt out. So you've got 1973, 74 peaks, and then basically a downward spiral of about 5 or 6 years, which was just shocking. And then it was gone. But the Bruiser War happened in the early 70s because Dick the Bruiser. So the territory that Johnny Doyle and Jim Barnett had that the Sheik bought was actually a two-part territory. There was a northern end, which was the Detroit part of it. And then there was the southern wing, which was like into Indiana. And it used to be one big piece. And the Sheik really only took the kind of Michigan, Ohio part. The Indiana part was taken by Dick the Bruiser and Wilbur Snyder. And they really just took it by force. They did not buy it the way Sheik did. They just ran Barnett and Doyle out. And so they were very aggressive. That's the thing. They were very they were invasive. I mean, they didn't believe in playing ball. And look, let's face it, none of this was legal. So it's not like they really weren't doing anything wrong. If anything, the people that were doing wrong were Johnny Doyle and was the Sheik, because there's free enterprise, right? So Dick the Bruiser and Wilbur Snyder, they had this attitude that we're going to try to come in and take all of it. We have we have Indiana. We're going to try to move northwest, and we're going to take the whole thing. And this started in 1971, and it went on for about 2 to 3 years. Now, most promotional wars in those days especially did not last that long. It was one of the longest in the territorial era of wrestling. And the reason it went on so long is not because, let me put it this way, it wasn't because the Bruiser was winning, because he never was. It was simply because he refused to give up. He refused to leave. So if you look at the numbers, as I did, and you compare back and forth, because they'd be running sometimes on the same night. So you'd have the Sheik and Cobo Arena on one side of Detroit. You'd have the Bruiser in Olympia Stadium on the other side of Detroit on the same night or on the same weekend, maybe. And almost every time, and I mean, this happened like dozens of times, almost every time the Sheik won, outdrew the Bruiser. There's a handful of times you could count on one hand and have fingers left over that the Bruiser actually drew more. But he had deep pockets. He had the promoter of the Olympia Stadium, Lincoln Cavalieri, on his side, who desperately wanted a piece of the wrestling pie. And it just kept going until it became an issue of television. In 73, the Sheik really started shaking things up by putting TV in the Bruisers territory. And that pissed off Vern Gagne and the AWA too, because the AWA was working with Dick the Bruiser. And that's when they finally backed off, because they really started feeling like it could backfire on them. But the worst thing that happened was, once the heat had subsided, the war was over, the record crowds that they were drawing also started to dry up. They were putting 12,500 people capacity crowds on a weekly basis, bi-weekly basis into Kobo. And then in a couple of years, it was 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people, which ironically today is an average Raw or Dynamite taping. But back then it was death for your promotion if your main shows were doing that number. So it was a high peak and then a quick decline.
Which is a good segue to what I wanted to ask you next. You write in the book about the Sheik's booking of himself, that he beat everyone, and then there was that schmoz with Andre the Giant. What would you say, given how high the heights were and then this decline? What were the major factors behind the decline of that territory? And do you think really that I know there's been a lot of ink on the Sheik and his booking turning fans off, but what would you, if you could delineate it down to a few factors, what would those be?
Well, there's two different sides of it. There's the Detroit side, there's the Toronto side. So the Sheik was running Detroit and he was booking Toronto, and he was booking himself in Toronto for Frank Tunney in the Maple Leaf Gardens. And it was a very hot run until it wasn't, right? And part of that was he created this winning streak for himself. The Undertaker had nothing on this. 127 singles matches at the Maple Leaf Gardens without a loss. Now, it's easy to do that when you're booking the main events, right? But people, it got ridiculous. Anyone that came through there, Lou Thez, multiple losses, Jack Briscoe, Dory Funk Jr., Bruno Sammartino, Pat O'Connor, anyone who came through there, Tiger Jeet Singh, they were all losing. And the thing you got to remember is he was the heel. It would be one thing if when Bruno did it, it was great because that's what people wanted to happen. That's what they were paying their money to see, And I don't think he understood that. So the Andre the Giant match is the tipping point in Toronto. That's what people always point to as the point where, and it's funny because we think of that time as, the fans believed in the reality of what they were watching. And that may be so. But when he brought Andre the Giant in and won by countout, even by countout, this was the first match that Andre the Giant had lost in about a year, basically since he first started getting his huge monster push. And that was the point where it was almost like even the people in Toronto just said, okay, this is getting ridiculous now. How in the world can, this is ridiculous. And it started to dry up. In a couple of years, the Tunnies basically, they kicked him out. They kicked him out of Toronto because the business was drying up, and they wound up going instead with Crockett as their partner there and getting better talent, better booking. But in Detroit, it's more of a gradual thing. It's because the war ends in 73, the continual booking of the Sheik at the top, the refusal to make new stars except for the Sheik's own son, which was a disaster, unfortunately. That was a real you talk to any fan of big time wrestling and they'll tell you that's like the jump the shark moment of big time wrestling is Captain Ed George as the top baby face. So you got all that. You got sorry
to interrupt, but did you mention in there that he didn't even really want, unlike some of the other promoters' sons of the time, he didn't really even want to be a wrestler?
Yes, and RVD had a funny story about that. I don't know. I don't know if there's a language restriction on here.
Not at all.
RVD in the preface to the book, he related this tale about, because Eddie Jr. got into the business as a wrestler in the mid 70s, and by 1980, about 9 months before Big Time went out of business, early 1980, he was out, and he was working. I think he was sales or just a regular job, and RVD said that the Sheik told him that at a certain point Eddie just came to him because Eddie Jr. never really worked anywhere else. He didn't really travel beyond the territory. Eddie Jr. came to him and said, "Dad, would you mind? I don't really know if my heart is in this. Would you mind if I just stopped?" And the Sheik said something like, "Why the fuck didn't you tell me that before? I mean, I put all this time and effort. All you had to do was tell me. We've been doing this for years. I've been trying to push you down people's throats, and now you tell me you don't want to do it, And that's also partly why he looked at Sabu the way he did. Sabu was almost like a son to him. Sabu became, carried the legacy on way more than, Eddie Jr. did. But, all that kind of stuff contributed to the downfall. If you look at the roster of Big Time Wrestling over the years, it doesn't change a lot. You can look at a card from 1973 and then look at a card in 1978, and it's all the same people hanging around. It's the same matches. It's the same feuds. Getting people just got sick of it. And then you also had the Sheik himself. I mean, he was making a lot of bad decisions. He had a gambling problem, apparently. He had problems with addiction, hard drugs. He was, being unfaithful to Joyce, which, look, a lot of those guys were doing. But the problem is that Joyce was very popular with the other promoters. She was very high profile. She wasn't just like a cute little wife who stayed at home that nobody saw. So, like Flying Fred Curry told me, it was like everybody was kind of going, how could he do that to Joyce? It was just making everyone uncomfortable. He was bringing his girlfriend around to shows, trying to get her booked. All these kind of things, these, as we call them colloquially, these personal demons, they added up. And when you have addiction problems, which started, from surgery that he had, an addiction to painkillers, what we would call today an opioid addiction for sure. You're making very bad decisions. You're not of sound mind. You owe money. You're gambling away your fortune. You're dumping your personal savings down the black hole of this, fading business. That's a recipe for disaster, because you look at these companies that went out of business. They all were going to go out of business eventually, but none of them is as just spectacularly disastrous as what happens to Big Time Wrestling in such a short period of time.
And he certainly liked to live large, so to speak, as you pointed out. A friend of the show, Rick Brooks, is asking about, he said he's seen the Sheik countless times in Cincinnati from the front row, but don't recall him ever having any of his managers with him. Did they only work the Kobo shows or the major arenas?
I'm not 100% sure of that, but it's a very safe bet, because in those days, that was done a lot, where the managers were heat seekers. They were there mainly to be on TV, to do the promos, to get the heat, to get people to come out to the matches. Like, for example, in the old school WWF, when it was still Northeast only, those guys, Grand Wizard, Blassie, Albano, a lot of fans will tell you that went to shows in that era, like at the Boston Garden or the Philadelphia Spectrum, they were not there. They would do TV, and they would go to the Garden, and that would be it. And so I think it's very possible that they had a similar deal in Big Time Wrestling, because the Sheik was very influenced by Vince Sr., actually. So it may have been a situation where guys like Abdullah Farouk, Eddie Creechman, they may have just been TV tapings, Kobo. Although, I mean, and Maple Leaf Gardens, obviously, but that was a different territory. However, Cincinnati Gardens was the number 2 venue in the Big Time territory. But, I mean, I wasn't there. So if Rick is saying that the managers were not there, I believe him. But it sounds to me like it was a very similar situation.
Now, a lot of people credit the original Sheik with the pioneering of what's referred to as the hardcore style, and you discuss that in detail in the book, the blood, the fire, the mayhem. Can you give fans a snapshot of the level of fear that he would inspire in fans?
His entire act was based on it, and his entire drawing power was based on people believing. And so, like, he would not have succeeded if people didn't truly, genuinely fear him. Like I've said before, and this isn't a knock on him, because I was misquoted once by a podcaster who tried to sensationalize what I said. Um, the Sheik as a character would not necessarily work today in the way that it did back then, because the level of belief is gone. So he could have done everything that he did, and he might have become a comedy figure. He might have become Danhausen or Orange Cassidy. It's just a different fan base. But it was the idea that you've heard the legend of this man. He would be on magazine covers. You would hear people talk about him. They would show footage, maybe. You would be intrigued, and they could bring him in cold, meaning you didn't need an angle, you didn't need a storyline, you didn't need to build it up. All you had to do, if you're in LA or in um, Amarillo, St. Louis, you could just say the Sheik will be here next month. And that was the draw. People would come. And it really harkens back to the nature of pro wrestling, the carnival roots of wrestling as an attraction, as an oddity, almost like a circus type of entertainment. The idea that this man is an attraction. Nobody cared about his work rate. Nobody cared about, him getting all of his moves in. It was the heat. It was the absolute terror that he could walk into a building and have 10,000, 20,000 people legitimately afraid that he could be walking down the aisle towards the ring and just make a quick jerk of his head. Grown men would jump over chairs, run 2-3 rows back to get away, almost like he had a force field around him. This is something that somebody could only accomplish in that era of wrestling. And he came along at the perfect time. But this is why, too, when you try to explain it sometimes nowadays, his significance to people that only know modern wrestling, it's hard to explain, because they'll watch his matches on YouTube and go like, what is this? I don't understand. He's just stabbing people and yelling. It is so much more than that. He is the ultimate you had to be there type of wrestling character. But it was a very real thing, and he made a fortune doing it.
I wanted to ask you. I know you've spoke on this before, but can you tell the story about the shooter from Michigan who came in and was bad mouthing the business, and the Sheik sort of dealt with it and further expanded his mystique?
Yeah, so this was a story that was told to me by a few different people I interviewed, and there was this idea that there had been an amateur wrestler, a very legit guy, who somehow knew about the Farhat family, and he had pieced it all together, and he was going to expose it, and he was trying to go backstage, and he was at a show, and he was telling people, I know who the Sheik is. I know who he is. His name is Eddie Farhat, and he's not even from Syria. He was born in America. He speaks English, blah, blah, blah. And the story got back to Sheik. And Sheik went into full on character mode. And, he added a little touch to it, because as we all know, the Sheik never spoke English on camera, right? But he found this guy lurking around the backstage. He came out of the locker room door. He found like a quiet corridor or room or whatever. He grabbed this guy by the throat, put him up against the wall. Some stories say that he held a razor to his throat. And I believe it, because he had them taped to his fingers a lot of times. Mm-hmm. And he said to him something like, yes, I am Eddie Farhat. And if you ever come here and say this to anyone again, I will cut your throat. And the guy never came back again. And he was absolutely terrified. And it's a shocking story, but this is what people did to protect their livelihoods back then, because a man like that telling a story like that could ruin the livelihood of many, many people in that town. And the Sheik first of all, the Sheik, and he was not going to let that happen. You had to protect it.
Which is a point that commentators and historians like Jim Cornette point out, that we're not the workers in the business nowadays are not doing enough to protect their business at all, let alone going to that sort of a length to do so. So quite an interesting story. I wanted to ask you about after the decline, and we're talking in the 80s. Why is it that so few in the industry wanted to work with the Sheik? And as a sidebar to that, 14 or 15-year-old me had tickets for the show in 1988, the Jim Crockett Promotions show where he was making the comeback, and I never went, and I'm kicking myself to this day. But why was it that he blew that opportunity, and then there was heat, if you will, with many in the business around that time frame?
Well, the chapter in my book that focuses on the 80s, I call it Wanderer in the Wilderness, because that really characterized that part of his career. It was like the lost period of his career, because he really did have a renaissance in Japan in the early 90s. The 80s was the dark point. He starts out the decade by getting blacklisted by the NWA. His company goes out of business in October 1980. He starts working for Outlaw Promotions, specifically the one in Atlanta. That was Jim Wilson and Thunderbolt Patterson. They were running opposition to Jim Barnett at the Omni, which was like one of the centerpieces of the NWA. So he got blacklisted, couldn't get work in the major territories anymore, couldn't go to Japan anymore because Giant Baba was an NWA member. So even Baba couldn't book him, which shows you how crazy that is, because it's not like any of the American territories are competing with all Japan. So it really was collusion. There's no other way to put it, right? They were trying to punish him. And he started working these rinky-dink towns. Look, he was getting old. He looked old. He looked every year of his age and then some. His act had worn out its welcome. He had become a bit of a parody of himself by that point. It was a new era for wrestling. The Hulk Hogan era was dawning. The national expansion was happening. He just found himself on the outside looking in. This was the point of time where, for a lot of other guys, they might have taken a backstage role in a major company, maybe become an agent, a producer, maybe settle into promoting in some form or fashion. It just didn't come together for him. People didn't want to work with him anymore. Again, even for the reasons that I mentioned, his problems got worse, his personal problems in the 80s. People didn't want to touch him. There's stories in the book about Mike LaBelle in LA, who had been one of his closest friends, not even wanting to take his phone calls anymore because of all the money that he owed him and drugs and everything else. And so he went bankrupt. I mean, he had a very, very hard time. The Crockett thing, when the Great American Bash came to Cobo in 1988, Kevin Sullivan, who was booking for Jim Crockett at the time, him and Dusty, he spearheaded bringing in the Sheik because he had been a Sheik disciple. He said, "We're bringing the Bash to Cobo. We've got to get the Sheik. If we get the Sheik on this show, he hasn't been in Cobo Arena in 8 years. We will do at least $100,000 gate." And they did. And the thing is, any other guy would have seen this as the ultimate lifeline. I will do anything you want, Mr. Crockett. Thank you so much. The Sheik wasn't that kind of guy. He still insisted on his 10% of the house, which would have been $10,000 just for him. He insisted on all this special treatment. He showed up in a stretch limousine, pulled into the back door of the arena while the show was going on in like a 3-piece suit, all decked out. And then, when they wouldn't pay him after the fact, he no-showed the rematch they were going to do. And I mean, this was a tailor-made comeback for him. He could have, who knows what he could have done with it. He could have, and then he could have settled into a job with WCW, which is actually what Dick the Bruiser wound up doing, his great competitor. He became a WCW agent. But it was not meant to be. It was ego. It was pride. It was not knowing when to let go. It was not knowing when your time has passed, and the business passed him by.
Yeah, yeah, it seems like a tremendously blown opportunity. I remember as a teenager at that time for the Bash, the promos for that I would get from Detroit TV. I was mesmerized by this guy. I'm like, okay, first of all, it's not the Iron Sheik, but then he did the promos with the fire and the snake and everything, and it just seems like that was in hindsight a tremendous mistake amongst many. You also note his time in FMW, and a lot of fans are familiar with the episode from Dark Side of the Ring. I believe it was last year, where they talk about this match that he was tremendously burnt in,
Hmm.
and that hardcore style that he was working as a senior citizen. What was the thought process there? And you speak as to the lingering effects of that, which I don't think the episode captured how dire his physical condition was after that. If you could speak on that.
Right, because the episode, if you remember, really wasn't about him. It was about FMW, so they're not really going to go down that road so much. But that was a turning point for him. Anybody else would have stopped. He didn't even stop. He went home for 3 weeks and then came back to the tour. He had third-degree burns on his back. People have confirmed this. I forget who it was. Someone I spoke to said they saw him on the plane with third-degree burns on his back that he was treating. He was coming back from being treated. Apparently, he briefly slipped into a coma. He had no business being in matches like that. Bottom line is the money was too good to pass up. I would have done it for the money they were giving him. And I've never stepped in a ring in my life, but they were paying him like $10,000 a match. Some people have said a week. I heard a match, whatever it was a ton of money. He definitely made in the millions, if not over $1 million working for FMW for sure.
Wow.
How could you say no? Especially the man's bankrupt. He owes money to everybody under the sun. Of course he did it. But you think about it and you look at it and it's sad because you think, as I think, this is somebody's grandfather. This is somebody who should be starting to collect Social Security. This is a man who hardly could get in the ring, let alone get out now that the ring is on fire, and Sabu told a story about how he instinctively leaped out of the ring because he's like Spider-Man. And then he thinks, oh my God, my uncle is still in there. And he looks back and they have to help him out. They're pouring water on him. And the best part is if you watch it, he's still in character through the whole thing. He comes out of the ring and you can't really see the burns yet on his back because you know how that is when you get severely burned. It doesn't show up immediately, or you don't usually see it immediately. He is throwing fireballs. He is, attacking, lunging at people while he's just been severely burned. And like I said, that wasn't even the end of his run. He kept wrestling for Onita for another year after that until he finally had a heart attack after a match in 95. And that's what did him in.
Wow, that's as they say, tougher than shoe leather.
Yes.
You talk about in the book Sheik's commitment to kayfabe and how legendary that was, including an anecdote from his funeral. I was just wondering if you could broach that now with the fans.
Sure. Well, the only person in the wrestling business that went to the funeral was Dave Brzezinski, Supermouth Dave Drayson, who was his last manager. Everyone else there was family and real life friends. No colleagues went. And I know Dave was always very bitter about that, but he mentioned how, and other people confirmed it, that the priest only mentioned his real name once at the beginning of the service. This is a funeral in a Catholic church, okay, because the Sheik was Catholic, and he called him Sheik, the priest. And I reached out to him. I found the priest. He didn't really want to be interviewed for the book. I understand that, but he confirmed that that was true, that he did refer to him because that's how everyone knew him, as Sheik.
Wow, that's incredible. What would you say, in a final analysis, would be the Sheik's enduring legacy to the business as a whole, and not only in terms of a wrestler, but a promoter, and just a legendary sort of character.
As a performer, you're talking about potentially, very arguably, the greatest heel of all time, the greatest drawing heel of all time in terms of drawing money, all over wherever he went for the longest period of time. And also in terms of how believed and feared and hated he was in a very real way. Putting that all together, because there's other people you could put on that list, the Roddy Pipers, the Buddy Rogers, the Harley Races and Killer Kowalskis of the world. But the Sheik may have been the greatest. As a promoter, it's more of in the category of the cautionary tale of how things could go wrong, of what not to do. And you can create something that's immensely successful, but you have to keep innovating. You can't just rest on your laurels and stick with what works and never try anything new or develop. You can't always take the safe road, because that's what he was doing. He was playing it very safe, because that will take you down a dark path and, lead eventually to your downfall from a business point of view.
Well, from a standpoint of yourself, do you have any projects in the works that that the fans of the history of the business would be interested in? Are you at liberty to disclose that? And can you talk about your podcast that I am a very big fan of?
Well, my podcast is Shut Up and Wrestle, and it's part of the Arcadian Vanguard Podcast Network, which is best known for the Jim Cornette podcast, the Jim Cornette Experience, and the Drive Through. The 605 Super Podcast from Brian Last, who really put everything together, and he gave me the platform. I've been doing it now for we're just coming up on the 56th weekly episode, so it's been over a year. It's an old school themed show, so it's like this. It's old school wrestling talk, conversation with people I know and I'm friends with, and I have prior relationships with, so it's always very comfortable and friendly. You can find it wherever you find podcasts. And the next book, I am doing a wrestling book. It's going to be a biography. It is through ECW Press, and I have been waiting for about 3 months now to get the contract finalized. I don't want to say specifically until I have it in writing and we are absolutely ready to go and off to the races. But I will say it's been agreed to verbally. It's going to happen. It is a biography. It is about someone who it was very important in the business and who has never had a book done about them. And that's about all I could say right now.
Well, we can't wait for that. I know I'll be checking that out for sure. Where can fans purchase the book? I know there's an audio version, and where can they stay in touch with you on social media, sir?
Sure. Well, the book, Blood and Fire, you can find it. It's in print, digital, and audio format. And I'm proud to say the audio version is me. I'm reading it. They allowed me to do that. I gently insisted to be allowed to do that, and they did. So you can get it in all formats. Really, I mean, Amazon is probably the easiest way for anybody. If you hate Amazon, you can go to barnesandnoble.com. In fact, I've even seen the physical book in the physical Barnes and Noble stores, if you're lucky enough to have one near you. But it's very easy to find. Even just Google it, Blood and Fire and the Sheik, and you'll find it. What was the other? Oh, social media. Yes.
Social media.
On Twitter and Instagram, I am Brian R. Solomon. And also there's a Facebook page for Shut Up and Wrestle if people are interested in looking that up too.
Perfect. Well, I can't recommend this book enough to the fans of the Hannibal TV and professional wrestling history. I got mine at Indigo in Canada. So there you go. I want to thank you very much for your time, Brian. And if you, when your next project comes out, if you would be open to coming back, we'd love to have you.
I would love to do that. Just say the word. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Fans, that's it for another edition of the Great North Wrestling Podcast. We will see you next on Sunday at our regularly scheduled time. Take care, everybody.